don't know me, I'm Marsha de Cordova. There we go, now I can hear. Hey, that's better. So I'm Marsha de Cordova and I'm the Labour Member of Parliament for Battersea. And I just want to say a very warm welcome to everybody that's here in person, but also a massive welcome to everybody that's joining us online. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. This is the first time we've actually been able to get together for the Tawney Dialogue since 2019, and isn't it wonderful to be in a room with people? Yes. Yes, it is. And we have an exciting evening ahead of us, actually. We are going to be, the theme for tonight is faith and the welfare state. And we've got a few experts, even in the audience, actually, on this subject matter as well. And we've got two brilliant speakers that are going to be sharing their own insights. Now, for those of you that are social media savvy, the hashtag for tonight is Tawney 2022, so please use that. Tonight's session will be in two parts. We'll hear from our great speakers, but then we'll move into a Q&A, starting with myself posing some questions to our guests, and then the question and answer session will be opened out to you guys. And for those watching online, if you would like to submit a question, you can do so in one of two ways. Either you can use the hashtag Tawney2022 with your question, or you can email info@christiansonTheLeft.org.uk with your questions, and then they will be posed later on. So I will shut up, because I'm sure you don't need to hear my voice anymore, and I'll introduce you to the first of our brilliant speakers. So tonight you're going to be hearing from Flo O'Taylor, who is a theology PhD candidate at Durham University, researching women's experiences of addiction through the lens of political theology. How interesting does that sound? And before her doctorate, she led the Arch, which is a Christian community that seeks to build relationships of solidarity and friendship with women experiencing multiple forms of marginalisation in the East End of London. Flo has a degree in theology from both Oxford and Durham universities, and she currently lives in County Durham. So Flo, over to you.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be with you. Thank you so much for having me. The prompt for our conversations tonight invite us to consider two important questions. Do we have faith in the welfare state? And if we do, what role does faith have to play? And I'd hope, as we try to answer these questions, to affirm in all of us the work of Christians on the left engaging with our faith with our politics. In our post-COVID world, but also before COVID, it is clear that our current welfare system is crumbling, with cost of living soaring and universal credit stagnating. The New Economics Foundation estimates that 23.4 million people, that's 34% of the UK's population, will be living below a socially acceptable minimum standard of living next month. All the while, in the first year of the pandemic, it recorded the biggest ever year increase in billionaire wealth in this country, with the average billionaire increasing their wealth by £630 million. Whenever we hear the invocation of the Blitz spirit, we must remember that we are not all in this together. Some people are being plunged into poverty, while others are actively profiting more than they ever have done before. I'd suggest that this is no unhappy accident, but the natural conclusion to a toxic political imagination that puts profit over people, seeing the welfare state as a cost to be minimized, even a site for corporate profit wealth creation, rather than a foundational pillar to a society that recognizes our social relatedness. And so, when faced with a politics that impoverishes so many, I'd like us to consider a Christian theopolitical imagination that might challenge and respond. And I'm going to root our reflections in three aspects of what it means to be human beings created in the image of a Trinitarian God, and what it means for this to be reflected in society. First, Scripture describes humans as dignified. Second, this dignity is relational. And insofar as we are not independent individuals living independent lives, but interdependent with God and each other. Third, this dignity is socially constituted through belonging to an us of society that can either witness or seek to deny our identity as image bearers. With this in mind, how then might we as Christians think about the welfare state? If I separate out the words welfare and state for a moment and ask whether we have faith in welfare full stop, this seems like an unnecessary question, doesn't it? Foundational to our Christian faith is a commitment to the biblical mandate to love our neighbors as ourselves. In Matthew 25, Jesus identifies himself with the least of these, making it clear that care for those in need is both foundational to our faith and a form of worship, as it is, in fact, care for God himself. And yet, when I ask the question, do you have faith in the welfare state, we might be a little more divided. As a church, so often we are discipled in what it looks like to love our neighbor at an interpersonal level. And this is so important. We are the church that formed the Trussell Trust and countless other interventions to support our neighbor's welfare. But the confusion arises because when it comes to politics, we are less confident in what neighbor love looks like. And yet, this was not always the case. Historically, the roots of the welfare state in the UK are in fact interwoven with Christian socialism. R.H. Tawney, among others, played a central role in its foundation, recognizing the centrality of material conditions for human flourishing and our collective responsibility to meet those needs. The then Archbishop of York implored Christians to support the welfare state, seeing it as the embodiment of the biblical principle to carry each other's burdens and in this way fulfill the law of Christ. The theopolitical imagination that formed the welfare state understood that we can only flourish as a society if we recognize our collective identity, acting together to take collective responsibility to meet the needs we all share. Learning from this, today we must recognize that individual lives occur in political contexts. So part of our call to neighbor love must be to consider the structural realities in which we all live and ask whether they are structures that promote welfare or cause harm. Just as Jesus lived in and challenged a society full of power dynamics, failing to witness the dignity of people, we are called to pay attention to the political and economic structures in which we live and interrogate where and to whom they deny dignity and belonging. Christian concern with the political realm is rooted in what we believe it is to be human. We are not autonomous individuals living independent lives, but relational creatures created in the image of a Trinitarian God. We are not simply a collection of I's, we are an us, with corresponding needs and obligations. And yet, as society is currently structured, so many people are excluded from this us along the lines of race, class, and economic status. And so the question of whether we have faith in the welfare state must begin by paying attention to the welfare state as it is, and asking whether it reflects a theopolitical imagination that sees everyone as dignified and creates a society that recognizes this dignity. And yet, as we know, under the Conservative government, we are witnessing an increasingly punitive system that fails to protect people from poverty. Child Poverty Action Group, who once thought in the 2000s we were to witness a near end to child poverty, have more recently concluded that our social security system is simply unfit for purpose and is in need of urgent and fundamental change. Instead of taxing wealth or increasing universal credit, the government has introduced regressive national insurance increases and is taking the NHS crisis as an opportunity to extend private healthcare's reach. These policies are rooted in a neoliberal political imagination that denies dignity and belonging to those it deems superfluous to economic productivity. Before looking at our second question about the role of faith in welfare, if we take seriously the need to shape a welfare state for the good of all, I'd like to offer a suggestion as to where we need to start. Because it's natural when faced with suffering of this scale that we want to avert our gaze or look for easy answers. And yet, thinking with Christian mystic, political activist, and philosopher Simone Weil, who herself was writing in the 1930s during a different period of crisis, I want to suggest that we resist these urges. Instead, we might pay attention to the reality of the dominion of force operant in our society, leading to the affliction of so many. Weil invites us to follow Jesus in attending to affliction in order to develop a theopolitical imagination capable of justice. Because this cannot go on. Attention, according to Weil, is born of love. It is the rarest and purest form of generosity. In its highest form, she describes it as prayer. Attention was the way of Jesus. He heard the cry of blind Bartimaeus, noticed the woman bent double in the temple, and felt the touch of the woman bleeding in the crowd. We can attend interpersonally, as the church is so good at doing, but we must then go further. Jesus paid attention to their affliction, and then he disrupted the imagination that would deny their worth. Weil describes how we naturally recoil from such realities, seeking surface level solutions to dilute our despair. At our sacred core, we relentlessly hope for the good, and it hurts to see the opposite occurring. She suggests it is only through God's grace that we can resist doing this. As we consent to the grace of God, we are transformed into his likeness, able to attend to the world in love. As we pay attention, we mirror God's posture of loving regard towards us. And so, when it comes to the current welfare system, we cannot shy away from how far from God's vision for humanity and society it has fallen, and the real harm this does to people. But we can take courage that this political imagination is not inevitable and can be ruptured. We must reckon with a system that creates classes of people who are constrained in their capacity to act for themselves or appear in their own terms. In biblical language, these are the orphans and widows. Today, they are the socially and economically deprived who are painted as depraved by the UK media and the powers of a punitive welfare system. But the Christian story talks of people created not to be productive or to consume, but for joy and relationship. To quote Archbishop Rowan Williams, the whole story of creation, incarnation, and our incorporation into the fellowship of Christ's body tells us that God desires us. We are created so that we may be caught up in this desire, so that we may grow into the wholehearted love of God by learning that God loves us as God loves God. In other words, we were created for joy, for desire, for love. And this has political implications. William sees grace as a transformation that depends in large part on knowing yourself to be seen in a certain way, as significant, as wanted. Rather than a punitive welfare system that denies dignity and belonging, we might struggle towards building one of abundance that recognizes we need each other and creates the structures in which we together might flourish. And so, our faith lies in what a transformed welfare state could look like. Which leads to our second question: what is the role of faith in the welfare state? How might we participate in the collective struggle of creating a society in which we might all belong? Firstly, we might recognize that it is not enough to state that every person has dignity. Instead, crucially, we must join in the struggle against the dominion of force that denies this truth, and join the collective movement of imagining and building structures and a welfare system that respects this dignity. For me, this is Jesus' first act of resistance, but also of care. Practically, the constructive work is pluriform, a tapestry weaving different threads of struggle and dignity that builds connection between otherwise disparate groups of people in pursuit of love and justice. It involves recognizing the current system is part of a wider problem with a society structured by neoliberalism and intersects with other injustices. Often the question of the role of faith is reduced to what role the church might play in providing welfare directly. But we know that the more fundamental question is a moral one, tied up with how we understand what it is to be human and to live together. It is a fundamentally theological question, bound up in questions of who we are and of human dignity and how we belong. It might begin by challenging particular policies like sanctions, fighting for universal credit payments to increase in line with inflation, and resisting the raising of the energy cap as the cost of living soars. But it must go further, challenging the political imagination that denies certain people dignity. Instead, we might collaborate with organizations and groups seeking to reimagine what it could look like to live well together. Campaigns for universal basic services, living income, and wealth taxes spring to mind. I hope to have spent some time here affirming us in our political work. Because while neighbour love for those who are currently marginalised includes pastoral care for their suffering, it must go beyond this to a question of justice and solidarity. Rather than charity or pity, those who are suffering under the current structures that oppress them deserve we hear their cries of injustice and challenge the dominion of force leading to their affliction. But this doesn't always lead to swift answers and must involve those who are suffering in their own liberation. In Vay's language, we must first pay attention to the dominion of force and learn how not to respect it, before joining in the struggle in dignity towards reconstituting societal structures that reflect our humanity and build towards our co-belonging. So, while we might struggle to have faith in the welfare state in its current manifestation, we must have faith in what we can together negotiate it to become. Grounded in a belief in inherent human dignity, we must join in the struggle in dignity for a welfare state that recognizes how God sees every person as significant as wanted. Thank you.
Brilliant. Wow. That was, I think everybody would agree that was absolutely fantastic, giving us such a great insight into where we are as people of faith, but more importantly, highlighting the real challenges of the inequalities of wealth, but the deep-root structural issues that are at play here, and many of this is due to political ideology of the current government that have been in power for such a long time, but also rooting our principles in the foundations of the character of Christ, in my opinion. So thank you so much for that. So now I'm very excited for our next speaker. Follow that. I know you will do very well, but yeah, I'm really delighted to introduce my colleague John Ashworth, who has been the Member of Parliament for Leicester since 2011. Is that right? Last November, he was appointed to the role of Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, which is why he's here this evening, obviously. But more importantly, he served as the Shadow Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, and in fact, he was Labour's longest running person in that post. No, it's not to laugh at, because I think everybody in this room would agree that John really did a fantastic job leading us through the pandemic. So I think it's really important to say that and absolutely holding this government to account. So thank you for all you did in that role. He is a policy fellow at the Centre for Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge. Before becoming an MP, he worked for the former Chancellor Gordon Brown and also worked for him when he was Prime Minister. And John, in his spare time, he is a keen bookworm and enjoys running. So there you go. So over to you, John, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Hello, is this on? Well, thank you very much, Marsha. And that was a lovely introduction. And if I may say so, you are a brilliant Member of Parliament for Battersea. You were a superb Shadow Equalities Secretary, a brilliant Shadow Disabled Persons Minister. I know you fight for the causes of social justice with passion and tenacity, and it's a pleasure to be on a panel with you this evening.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.
That was an extraordinarily detailed speech of depth and insight, so apologies in advance that I will not be able to meet the standard that has been set. But nonetheless, I will try my best. But if I do get stuck, I do have the benefit of having in the room with me this evening two predecessors who will be able to jump in and speak with greater authority and insight than I could ever hope to muster. Can I just start by saying it's great to be here with your chair, Johnny, who I believe has just been re-elected as the chair. I first met Johnny, I think 23 years ago, 23 years ago, 22 years ago. 99. You'd hope somebody in the work and pensions brief could add up, wouldn't you, really? But we did meet in 1999 on the steps of the Manchester University Student Union. And we were on our way, I think, we were picked up and we were on our way to the Llandudno Labour Conference in Wales. And we've been good friends ever since. And Johnny was a brilliant Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. He is now a brilliant campaigner for jobs, for industry, for investment, and he'll make an absolutely superb business secretary in a future Labour government. So it's great to be here with you, Johnny. If I get stuck, and if Johnny gets stuck and can't answer the question for me, then we have the brilliant Stephen Timms here as well, who has got an advantage over Johnny, myself, and Marsha, because he actually served in government as a pensions minister, as a chief secretary to the Treasury, as the minister involved in the New Deal as well, back and working on the New Deal back in the day. And because of the decisions, because of the policies, because of the commitment of people like Stephen, that Labour government was able to lift children out of poverty, pensioners out of poverty, and was able to restore faith in the welfare state. So thank you, Stephen, for everything that you do and continue to do now. I'm slightly reminded, because you mentioned my work back in the day when I was younger and more youthful, working for Gordon Brown, and it reminds me of a story he would tell, which I'm sure you've all heard, when, and this point about maybe Johnny or Stephen might have to jump in for me, and Gordon Brown would tell this story about Albert Einstein. Do you know this story? It was a story how back in the 1950s, Albert Einstein was doing a tour of the United States explaining his theories of relativity and so on. And of course, it was the days before mass television or mass access to television and all so on. So the days when everybody would go along to big meetings to hear speakers. And he was doing this day after day, night after night, and he was naturally getting quite tired. And he was driven around the country by a chauffeur, and he was in the back of the car looking absolutely exhausted. And the chauffeur said to him, "Look, I've heard this speech, like 100 times now. I know it word for word. Why don't you let me pretend to be you, and I'll deliver the speech for you, and you just sit at the back and pretend to be the chauffeur." Because it was the days before people didn't necessarily know what people looked like, because there wasn't television. So Albert Einstein said, "All right, I'm so exhausted." He put on the chauffeur's cap. He sat at the back of the room, and the chauffeur came up to the front like this. And he delivered the speech on relativity. Absolutely word perfect. The audience applauded. And then the chair said, "Are there any questions?" And somebody put their hand up and asked a fiendishly complicated question about could Mr. Einstein really explain the exact nature of how a black hole operates and what it means. And the chauffeur was ashen. He didn't know what to do. And then he got it. He said, "This question is so simple, I'm going to ask my chauffeur to come up and answer it." So if I get stuck, I may well have to get Johnny or Stephen to come up. And there was also going around with events such as this, with Gordon Brown in the days when this organisation was known as the Christian Socialist Movement, and I would often come to these events with Gordon, and he would be a speaker at your different events, at the conferences and so on, and do wonderful speeches of great moral force about how we had to tackle poverty, not just in this country, but across the world. And but Gordon would always start off with a joke at these events, and he would say that growing up, because he was famously a son of the manse, of course, and in the Scottish Presbyterian Church, but he would say growing up, going to listen to sermons, not necessarily his own father's sermons, but other sermons, you could always tell the political persuasion of the minister giving the sermon based on what they would say, what scripture they would quote, or what hymn they would ask for in the Sunday following the general election. And if the party that the minister supported had won, the minister would say, "Praise be to the Lord." If the party that the minister didn't support won, the Tories presumably, he would say, "Forgive them, Lord, for they know not what they do." And if the third party, the Liberals, won, the hymn would be, "The Lord moves in mysterious ways, yes, wonders to perform." Look, I'm
going to use
really,
these jokes.
really, I'm really pleased to be here to talk about the importance to faith personally to me, to talk about the situation we find ourselves in and as a country, and perhaps offer one or two reflections about the way forward. And I thought your speech, Flo, was absolutely superb, because it stood as a reminder that for me, and I'm not making any judgment on those of a different political persuasion, I'm not that type of politician, but for me, when you read Scripture, I don't believe you can come away with Scripture without having one's socialist principles reinforced. And I think for me, one of the most important parts of Scripture is that line in Mark's Gospel about "Thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself. There is none other commandment greater than these." Surely that, as a principle, has to be at the heart of our socialist or social democratic or progressive values, whatever terminology you prefer to use. And of course, growing up, I was always struck by the stories in Scripture which again reinforced the sense that one must always stand for fairness and justice. The parable of the Good Samaritan, the Jesus going in and throwing the moneylenders out, the lines about the meek inheriting the earth, the gospel that reminds us that a rich man cannot enter heaven, or it's harder for a rich man to enter heaven than a camel to enter for the eye of a needle. You will know all of these stories. You'll know them with greater familiarity than I, no doubt. And one of the things that strikes me and has struck me particularly, although it's obviously something that we all intuitively know anyway, but something that has always struck me since I became the Member of Parliament in Leicester, where Leicester, as I'm sure you are all aware, is a wonderfully diverse city. In fact, probably the most diverse city in the United Kingdom, possibly outside of London. And one of the things that if you ever come to Leicester, which I hope one day you all do, you'll see that in our city that it's not unusual for there to be a church on the street next to a synagogue, next to a mosque, next to a Gurdwara, next to a Hindu temple. We are the city of every faith, and of course there are people of no faith. And as you will know, that when one studies the different faith groups, there is a golden thread running through all those different faith groups which connect us one to another and remind us that we have more in common with one another than what divides us. As we know as Christians, do to others what you would have them do to you. But Muslims say, no one of you is a believer until he desires for his brother that which he desires for himself. The Torah, what is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow man. The Hindus say, this is the sum of duty to do naught unto others which cause pain if done to you. The Sikhs will say, treat others as you would be treated yourself. The Buddhists, hurt not others in ways that you yourself would find hurtful. A golden thread running through every faith group, which I believe is a basis of our values and what I hold dear as a socialist and a Christian as well. But today I just want to, if you like, if I can put it in these ways, in these terms, if you like, share with you my testimony, if I can put it in those terms tonight. Because I come at these issues, I express my values as a Labour politician and as somebody who would define himself as a Christian, not just because of what I've read in Scripture and learned, and I was just saying earlier, I nearly did theology at university, but I changed to politics and philosophy and did some economics as well. But sometimes I do I do wonder if I should have carried on with my plans to study theology. But if you like, my values isn't just because of what I've studied and what I've read. It's because of the circumstances in which I grew up. And I was really interested when you said you're studying addiction, because addiction is something personally very important to me. I don't know, you may have seen it, you might not have done, but I've spoken in the past about how addiction took away my father. A working class man from Salford who failed his 11 plus and went to secondary modern and was intelligent, well-taught, but was denied so many opportunities in life because of that cruel system that was in place in those times. Succumbed to alcohol abuse and sadly died when he was 60. And when you say I enjoy running, I actually run I've run 3 London marathons for a charity that supports children of alcoholics. I've not decided if I'm going to run a 4th one. There must be other ways to fundraise for them. But it's not just growing up in the shadow of addiction which has informed my politics. It's also growing up in circumstances of poverty. Not poverty throughout the whole of my childhood, but for significant moments of my childhood. Growing up in a divorced family, a broken home with a mother who would count the pennies that she'd got in tips from the pub where she was the barmaid. And what I know, that when you grow up in poverty and you have disadvantage, it haunts you for the rest of your life. And it becomes the thing that you could never escape. You are constantly calculating about what you can do and cannot do. You're constantly worried that something's going to come along and drag you back in to those most desperate of circumstances where everything is a struggle to survive. And this brings me on to what we are seeing today and why I'm so angry about today's statement in the House of Commons. Because those experiences growing up has taught me that, if you like, wealth should be not just for the wealthy, but it should be shared for everyone. Prosperity should be for everyone. And equality should not be woven into the fabric of our society. And indeed, as Tawney said himself, the conversion of economic power should be the servant of society. But we didn't get that today. Let me just tell you what's going on in our country at the moment. And by the way, I want to thank you for all that you have done on issues of poverty and food banks, because I know, particularly in the pandemic, it was people of faith who ran the mutual aid groups, who ensured the food banks were running, that ensured the lonely had someone to talk to. And I think it's important we mention that, particularly it's the 2-year anniversary of that lockdown today. But what we have got in our society now, we've got child poverty increasing, probably set to increase to levels even higher than it ever was under Margaret Thatcher. We've got destitution so severe that there are over 500,000 children tonight going to bed without an adequate bed to sleep in, some of them sleeping on the floor. 550,000 destitute. That means they cannot afford any of the basic necessities of life. At a food bank in my constituency, I was told of a story of a woman who was given some fresh food, and the woman said, "I'm going to have to switch my fridge back on." She's had her refrigerator unplugged because she cannot afford the electricity bills associated with keeping the fridge running. One of the big supermarket bosses was on the news this morning, from the guy who runs Iceland. He was saying that food banks are turning down their donations of potatoes and root vegetables because they're finding that people cannot afford to boil them in their pans of water because of the bills involved. And universal credit, which was introduced or increased in the pandemic to help people, was cut by £20, and Johnny did a brilliant campaign against that cut when he was in the working pensions bill. Absolutely brilliant. But having cut universal credit by £20 a week, £1,000 a year for some of the most vulnerable and poorest people in society, they are now cutting universal credit again because inflation is so out of control and surging that people on universal credit are going to face hundreds of pounds worth of cuts in real terms, the second cut to universal credit within 6 months. Or people on disability benefits. There are a lot of disabled people, because of the circumstances of their condition, who have higher electricity bills and energy bills, because they might need to use a ventilator or food pumps or other equipment, which naturally means their energy bills are higher. We've got stories of disabled people not washing themselves or not washing their clothes, keeping their soiled clothes because they cannot afford the electricity bills to survive. More and more disabled people going to food banks as well. Pensioner poverty is on the increase again. 200,000 pensioners into poverty last year, increasing. When we came into government in 1997, a third of pensioners were in poverty. Stephen and Gordon Brown and others brought pensioner poverty right down because of things like the pension credit and increases in the state pension. Pensioner poverty is increasing again, and it started increasing before the pandemic. So it's not to do with the pandemic. And again, what is the response? Because of inflation, those who rely on the state pension are going to see hundreds of pounds cut from their state pension this year. The first time pensioners have had a real terms cut in their income for years. And today was the day when we should have had action from the government to help people with the cost of living. But we didn't get that. Rishi Sunak essentially didn't U-turn on the cuts to universal credit, the cuts to disability benefits, the cuts to the state pension. People are going to be so worse off. He's trying to present himself as this great tax cutter. He's actually effectively putting up a tax by less than what he proposed to do last year. He's putting up tax. So he's not a tax cutter, he's a tax rising chancellor. And when you look, as always often happens with budgets, all the experts are doing their analysis now, but some of the analysis that has come out so far suggests on the distribution analysis that the richer people, the richer households, are better off as a result of this budget by something like between £450 to £500, whereas poorer households who are set to lose hundreds and hundreds of pounds in universal credit cuts and energy bills are only going to be better off or only gain something like £120. 4 times more of the benefit of today's tax decisions go to richer households than poorer households. What an absolute disgrace that is. This is why when Johnny was doing the role of working pensions, he talked about how we're going to have to fundamentally reform universal credit, deal with these issues like there's technical issues, but things like the 5-week wait and so on, and ensure that everybody gets the dignity they deserve. It's why Rachel Reeves has said we've got to do more on energy and impose a windfall tax on the big gas and oil producers in order to fund an expansion of the warm homes discounts to take up to £600 of people's energy bills. But we've got to go further as well, I believe, because we are indeed facing a crisis where people had been denied their basic dignity, as you were talking about. And as I said, it's the 2 years since the pandemic, the lockdown for the pandemic. And surely that pandemic has exposed these sharp inequalities in society which demand action. Why was it the poorest, those in low-paid jobs, who were most exposed to the virus, more likely to catch the virus because they had to go to work, they didn't have the advantage of staying at home and joining Zoom calls? And it was often the poorest who were more likely to be hospitalised, sadly. It's the poorest who were more likely to die in that pandemic as well. I saw it in Leicester, where we have huge levels of poverty, lots of overcrowded inner city housing, where we had real problems with the virus, and you may recall we had to go into our own separate lockdowns and things like that. And what it reminded me, or what it brings into sharp focus again, is something that I was always passionate about when I was the Shadow Health Secretary, and I'm equally passionate about in this world as working pensions, is that poverty and deprivation means you get ill quicker in life and you die sooner in life. And what that means is right this second, right now, a child born in this area, or perhaps in Battersea, or in my inner city, Leicester seat, or East Ham, or parts of Manchester, that child born right this second is likely to live around 10 years less than that child born in the wealthier parts of the country. That child born right this second is more likely to develop chronic illnesses, disabilities in 20 years before somebody born in the wealthiest parts of the country. That child born right this second in the poorest parts of the country, right now, more likely to leave school obese, more likely to be admitted to hospital at some point in their childhood, more likely to need the support of mental health services, particularly when they become an adolescent. These are widening inequalities that we as socialists are rightly appalled at, and it's why we need a Labour government to do something about it. So that is my commitment as well. So this is a passion of mine in health, but actually if I want to tackle some of these deep inequalities, actually being in the work and pensions brief, ensuring people have decency, dignity, a proper standard of living. We have a system that not just alleviates poverty and deprivation, but prevents poverty and deprivation. Surely that is something that is worth fighting for as socialists. I said that I worked for Gordon Brown, and I tell some of his jokes and all that. But I think the lesson that I learned working for Gordon Brown and for my own life experiences is that it doesn't have to be like this. We don't have to have 4 million children in poverty. We don't have to have 2 million pensioners in poverty. We don't have to have 500,000 children going without a bed to sleep in. We don't have to have more food banks than McDonald's. We can make different choices. We can make different decisions. And that's what we need to show that we will do. And that's how we need to give people hope. Gordon Brown tells this great story of, and you'll probably have heard it, he tells this wonderful story about Nelson Mandela and Nelson Mandela's prison cell. And in that bleak prison cell, Nelson Mandela had a famous photocopy of a famous painting. And the painting is called Hope. And it's of a blinded girl sat on a globe trying to play a broken harp with one string. And you can look at this painting and you think, why on earth would you have that? Why is that called Hope? And the point is that even though the blinded girl is trying to play a harp with one string, she's absolutely convinced that despite the circumstances in which she finds herself, she can still produce beautiful music. And that photocopy of that painting was on the wall of Nelson Mandela's prison cell because it gave him hope as well. And that's what we need to do as a Labour Party. We need to make sure that people go on their journey with hope as well. And if we do that, then we are standing in the great tradition of this movement and the Labour Party movement. Those people who came together, who strongly believe that our principles are for application, not for decoration. Or as John Smith has said, that we have to serve. Those people who, over 100 years ago now, dreamed the impossible dream and looked beyond the lean horizon of their years and believed devoutly that we could have a more just and humane society. That's what we are about. That is what we are campaigning for. So please let us all come together in united effort. Let us be the children of that better and brighter day, and let's fight for that society of justice. Thank you very much.
That was incredible. I actually said amen. At the end, I felt like a sermon because, you really left us with hope because that is what will carry us through this. But you also set out so well just how stark the situation is. But more importantly, it's saying that it doesn't have to be this way because it really doesn't. These are all choices. And, the Chancellor had an opportunity today to try and do things differently, but he chose not to. I won't retell the stats, but because John set them out so well, but us as the Labour movement, it really is now going to be down to us to set out how we would want to bring about that change, rooted in our Christian and our socialist values. I think that's what we are all here for this evening. I'm hoping to kind of have that discussion. So can I just say a massive thank you to Flo and John this evening. So we're now going to go into a Q&A session, and I'll kick off with a real big one so that we can all unpack. So, Flo, I'll start with you really, and then John can kind of pick up at the end. But, if we were going to be in government, what would you like to see a Labour government do in terms of, I say the social security system because I hate the term welfare, and I'm able to say that because I'm in the chair, but it's not a term that I subscribe to. We have a welfare state, but we have a social security system. That should be a safety net. So over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. I think shifting the narrative, I think that is the most fundamental thing we need to do. We realise that politics is a practice of the imagination. And when we have the imagination that the Tories propagate of sort of welfare scroungers, the undeserving poor, we do so much harm in that rhetoric that's then embedded in real life policies. And so I think you're right that the shift towards a social security system is something that I think the Labour Party must do, that recognises that actually we are all, in the same way that we need a universal healthcare system, we need a universal care system, we need a universal social security, recognising that while some of us are shielded as it stands, actually we all have needs and they all need to be met. And if anything's shown it, the pandemic has. Lots of people who have never needed social security previously have been on furlough, have needed to rely on the government in a way that previously they might have been shielded from. So for me, I think the Labour, if the Labour Party were in government, please God, it would be I think a real shift away from neoliberal policies towards a social security system that worked for all, that shifted away from a focus on profits towards a focus on the welfare of all of us.
Thank you very much. John, do you want to come in on that?
Well, I think we have got to rebuild our social security system.
Yes.
And I'm fortunate because I've inherited a lot of the work on that Johnny did when he was in the brief what was it, a year, 18 months or so. We've got to fundamentally reform the way in which universal credit works. It absolutely cannot be right that people are expected to wait 5 weeks for their first payment, which means that they often get into debt because they have to take out a loan from the state, and the state chases them for those debts. I think we've got to do other things as well. We need a new child poverty strategy. Yeah. The last Labour government did great things on child poverty. This government abandoned the target and refuses to even accept standard definitions of child poverty. It cannot be right that we have so many children growing up in poverty, in destitution, without beds to sleep in, with their families going to food banks. But there are other things we've got to do as well. I think we've got to, which is about the welfare state, and I'm naturally focusing on the social security aspect of it. But you look at health. You've got the National Health Service is on its knees with millions on the waiting lists. Mental health provision in this country is absolutely abysmal. There are so many young people not getting the mental health support that they need. And on the education side, again, part of the welfare state. Look, UNICEF said children may not be the biggest. It may not be the face of the pandemic, but they're amongst its biggest victims. I mean, you think that children have lost the best part of 2 years' worth of learning. Our colleague in the Shadow Cabinet, Bridget Phillipson, is doing great work speaking up for children and putting forward proposals about what we need to do to support children. But again, this government is completely letting them down. So there is so much we have to do, and we have to maintain our faith in the welfare state. We need to champion social security, and we need to argue with passion, and we need to convince people out there that we will rebuild.
I think you're absolutely right, actually, John. We absolutely have to rebuild our social security system, but widening it out, looking at the welfare state overall. And one of the other areas is also social care, which this government have failed to invest in with any great wealth at the moment. And then for yourself, Flo, you talked a bit about, you know, universal systems, and you know, this is a subject. The question I'm going to ask you now is difficult because people have very different views on it. But do you think we're in a space where we should be looking at like a universal basic income or some sort of minimum income standard, or, you know, just what's your views around that?
Yeah, I'm going to answer as a theologian rather than pretend to be a politician. But I have thoughts on it, because I think it reflects where we see value to be, right? And what it means to be human. Is our value and dignity tied up in our economic productivity, or are we seen to be creatures created in the image of God for relationship and to flourish? And therefore, what does it mean to build structures and the foundations for our society that give the conditions that mean that we have the possibility of flourishing? And so for me, I think that the progressive values underlying a lot of the work around UBI, around the universal basic income, are really good. I personally am even more excited about some of NEF's work, New Economic Foundation, their work around the universal basic services, because for me it seems to be more directly connected in with a collective view of what it means to be an us rather than simply a collection of I's. That it's rooted in that we all have needs, and that we can't have those needs met simply as consumers with money, but actually that some of those needs are best met with better provision of universal services and an extension of the welfare state. But I think definitely within that, I would love to see space for a minimum income guarantee that's either, so definitely I think it would be it's the sort of radical policy shift that we need in order to rescue the UK from the situation that John's described so well. Clearly.
Yeah. Do you want to come in on that? Or?
Sure. I mean, I'm personally not convinced that universal basic income is the best and most effective way to tackle poverty, particularly for the price bill that it comes with. But on day one of a Labour government, we are going to inherit poverty and deprivation so severe, of a scale so devastating, that we will have to take action quickly to really target support for those who need it. That, when you know that you've got so many children in poverty, you cannot walk by on the other side. Then, once I think you've done these immediate things, I think then you can have you can start thinking about your longer-term reform of the system. But I just think things will be such desperation that would have to take action to support people pretty quickly, using the tools that we've got at our disposal, and then we rebuild from there.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. It's funny because I have a personal view. I'm allowed to say that in chair. I can't I? I mean, because I'm not hugely in favour of the UBI models personally. I think we should maybe look around how we can introduce some sort of minimum income standard or model of guarantee, because it doesn't fully capture how you would support people with extra additional living costs. And I think that's where it kind of falls down for me. But I know there are others that I've done a lot more work in this area than myself, but that is just my kind of initial thoughts on it. So just moving on to what a Labour government could do again, just around how we can kind of, how would we seek to build an economy that really seeks to want to redistribute wealth so that we are together and it's not just about a collection of individuals, as you've already said, Flo.
Well, I mean, shall I just jump in on that one? I mean, you know, growth needs to be inclusive. This is the sort of one of the buzzwords that gets used now in amongst the sort of different think tanks, and that's where, you know, the social security system has a role to play, because you cannot have a strong growing economy if you are willfully impoverishing people. Stronger economies which do well and have good rates of growth have a decent social security system. But that's when you've also got to take the other decisions that you're taking on investment, which you know, Johnny is leading on in his business brief. It's how you distribute your I hate this phrase levelling up, because I think it's meaningless and we shouldn't reinforce it. But it's how in which you fund your local authorities and the role that they play. It's also about the investment in green technology and infrastructure, which Johnny and Ed Miliband and others are leading on. These are really key things for us, because our growth has been so anemic, which is why Rishi Sunak has limited room for manoeuvre when you step back from it, and which is why he's had to put up so much tax in the last 2 years. And it's all very well, again, him saying, oh, I'm tax cutting. It hardly offsets. I might have got the figure wrong, but I think it only offsets about a sixth of his tax rises. I might have got that figure wrong, but the point being is that it doesn't go anywhere near to offset all these other tax increases. He's had to do all those tax increases because growth is anemic, because we are not making the right long-term investment decisions. We're not investing in jobs, we're not investing in work. And as I say, if you have a weak social security system, I believe that undermines growth as well.
Brilliant. Do you want to come in on that?
I'm not going to add much in terms of policy, but I think that what you're saying there reflects again how and what our priorities need to be. And I think investment in jobs, in social security, in these foundations that shifts us from seeing the welfare state as a cost to be minimized, and instead recognizes that it is one of the foundations to a healthy economy. And what is this economy for? It is for the welfare of people rather than simply for profits. And I think, for profit. So I think that, simply put there, I think wealth tax is an interesting route to go down. I think there are more progressive routes of taxation that could be pursued. But I'll leave it there.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So what would you say the role of the church would be in this? Because we're all Christians, most of us in this room, and so we're all probably part of the church, but the church globally, but then obviously the church locally as well. How do they fit into this, and what role do they, or should they be playing in this? Should they be playing a role?
I think it's a really good question, and it's got so many different facets. You could pick up so many different facets for an answer to it. I think fundamentally we need to recognize that the church exactly is already doing so many good things locally. You listed a number of them. But also to recognize the power that we have, both in local churches with gathered congregations of people who are really quite well organized, right? If we're talking about organizing for power, churches are spaces that usually are organized. And if we refuse the narrative that said that faith is the personal, it shouldn't get into politics, and actually said, you know what, our values are really important at interpersonal level, but actually we really care about the societal structures too. And if we allowed for our churches to, as organizations like Christians on the Left do so brilliantly, to step into that political space, I think that there is a real opportunity there for the church to reclaim its prophetic voice. I think that requires, at certain parts of the established church, to recognize where we have been too much in the pockets of the establishment, where we haven't taken up the call to be the prophetic voice that we are called to be, and to repent of that and recognize where we have been part of the problem. But I think that there is a huge opportunity for us to be joining in with the Spirit's movement, right? And recognize where the Spirit is already moving in and beyond the church, and build broad-based collaborations and connections between different religions, different organizations, to pursue a more just society.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. I want to raise a concern, but also make a point about where I take inspiration. My concern is that I've got nothing but tremendous admiration for those who run our food banks, whether they're a church food bank or a faith group food bank, or indeed, those who've got no connection to faith. I've got nothing but respect and admiration for the people who work in our food banks. But to be frank, I want to be a Secretary of State for Work and Pensions who closes food banks. Yeah. Not because I don't want, not because I'm cruel, but because I don't want there to be need for food banks. My worry is that the Tories' whole approach, and we saw this today, is to give pots of money to local authorities, we can badge it in different ways, but essentially sort of social fund type money, which, if you've got a good Labour sort of council, they'll do proper stuff with it. But you just get lots of local authorities who just sort of hand that money on to their local food banks and say, here's some money, get on with it, or to a church food bank. And what you've got is, because of necessity, you've got church groups, faith groups, other food banks, bedding banks, furniture banks, baby banks as well, stepping in because under the Tories the welfare state has become so threadbare. So, as a Labour politician, I've got nothing but admiration for the people running these, but they shouldn't have to run them, and they're only doing it because the state or the welfare state has been so hacked back under the Tories. But I do take so that's obviously not a criticism of the church, but it's a concern about the way in which the Tories are playing this. But of course, I naturally have huge inspiration, take huge inspiration from our churches and our faith groups of the way in which, particularly in recent years, indeed throughout history, have mobilised public opinion for great causes. And there have been many great causes throughout history where the church groups have mobilised from abolitionist causes, anti-slavery causes, women's vote causes. I mean, sometimes even trying to make an argument for temperance. We don't hear that one so much anymore. I'm not sure how many politicians would want to support that campaign these days. But anyway, but in recent years, it's been church groups, Christian groups, faith groups who've demanded, particularly when we were in government, that Gordon Brown go further on debt relief, and he did in response, and international aid, and he did in response. Who've campaigned for the living wage as well in our communities. And continue to campaign now against these desperate cuts in things like universal credit that we have been facing. So I think the way in which faith groups mobilise public opinion on these issues is inspirational, and indeed I would want and hope that when we become a Labour government, they continue to mobilise because they need to put pressure on us as well. That's important that voice is heard. And that governments hear that voice.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. The church absolutely does have a role to play, particularly when it comes to campaigning and influencing, but they certainly should not be there as a social security safety net. Yes. I think that's fundamental. Okay, so I'm going to open it out to questions now from the floor. I think we've got, is it Mariana is going to be roving around with the mic for us? Or it looks like it's going to be Lou. We can share a mic. Yeah, there you go. Fantastic. So, who's got questions? And Lou will come to you with your question. I think so. Yeah, let's do it. Please say your name and where we're from. And
thanks, Lou. Hi, I'm David Smith. I'm from Sunderland. Thank you to Flo and to Jonathan. My question is, often we differentiate, I think, between in the welfare state between the NHS and everything else, where the NHS is universally liked, we all love it, because at some point we all use it. Everybody in society at some point will use the NHS, or a loved one will use the NHS. Whereas other parts of the welfare state, particularly the social security system, we've allowed that, I think, particularly because of the Tory narrative, to be sneered at and to be seen as something, the whole narrative around deserving poor and that kind of thing. So my question really is it time for us in the Labour Party to start much more making the moral case for the other parts of the welfare state in the way that Flo outlined?
I think sometimes the church can introduce an element of confusion here. In Christian belief, there's a strong element of depriving yourself. That's a virtue, do without. And I think sometimes this creeps into our social policies, that people get the idea that, I think it was mentioned in the discussion, that actually sort of treating people to poverty is some sort of virtue. It's something that those of us with kind of middle class values, as you put off things and you get them later and so on. There's not enough expressed in Christianity about the sheer, not just the pleasure. Oh, it's a wicked thing, pleasure. We must have austerity. The feeling that incorporated in this kind of approach, which I see you trying to introduce, is yes, get out and spend wisely, but spend, don't just sort of hold back.
Thank you. And Andrew Pakes from Kingston upon Thames. The current welfare state grew out of major events in the 20th century with Beveridge, NHS, the Education Act. the way things are at the moment, is this not an opportunity to revisit these policies? Add into them as well COVID, climate change, and we now have global integration. And instead of being fixed on policies of the 20th century that don't relate to our situation in the 21st century, which I suggest the current government are struggling with, is this not an opportunity to sit down and rethink these policies and come up with a modern, effective security system?
Thank you. Would you like to kick off, Flo?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for I'll answer the first question. I think I absolutely agree. I think that the moral, that we need to see our duty to develop a welfare state as a moral imperative, I think is absolutely the case. I think it's an interesting one, this division that happens between the NHS, which, as you say, is sort of the nation's sweetheart, and then the welfare system, which is, or people who use the welfare system, seen as sort of this embarrassing thing that we want to sweep away. That is not an accident, that's been constructed. And fortunately, that means it's also not natural. It means it can be deconstructed, and we can reconstruct a way of engaging with society that recognizes that our humanity is inherently interdependent. That people have needs, economic or otherwise, is not something to be ashamed of. It's something to be recognized as inherently part of what it is to be human. In my work and research, I spend a lot of time with women with lived experiences of addiction, and I'm looking at sort of their experience of addiction in the UK society. And the biggest harm, they say to me so often, that comes around again and again, is the social shame that comes with their suffering. That their experience of addiction, which is socially formed in itself, there's no such thing as a sort of individual sort of moralizing. There are lots of narratives that are moralizing around addiction, but addiction is a socially situated situation, experience that is often a response to other forms of suffering and coping with those things. But even in the midst of that, what women so often tell me is the deepest suffering that they experience is the social suffering. It's not being taken seriously when they walk into the room. It's having shame around asking for help when they need it. And so I think you're absolutely right, because the problem is that sort of shame and stigma means that there isn't the help when they ask for it, because we've then created structures that minimize the investment that happens into drug and alcohol services, because it's seen as embarrassing. It's not seen to be, people who experience it are seen as blameworthy and therefore not worthy of the help that actually they require. And so I think absolutely we need to see these things in moral terms, and therefore as Christians have an obligation to advocate for the development of a better welfare state.
Thank you. John.
These are really, really, really good questions. So let's just start with David from Sunderland. I'm really fascinated by this comparison between the National Health Service and the social security system, and I suppose I have an advantage of having spent so long doing health policy, as you said, Marsha, the longest serving Labour Shadow Health Secretary in history. So I'd much rather have been the longest serving actual health secretary in history, but anyway, that's a different matter. Hopefully I'll be the longest serving Work and Pension Secretary in history. But I've always been interested in this, because the creation of the welfare state was about taking the shame out of need. And before the National Health Service, we had a situation in this country that if you were not fortunate enough to pay into a sort of local, ad hoc sort of community health thing that which had been organised, you literally had women in the throes of a difficult labour having to pay for a midwife to come to their bedside, or you had men in tears, not because of the pain of their condition, but because they couldn't afford the medicines for their children, which were being sold on the black market. And on the first day of the National Health Service in 1948, there were men and women queuing up to see a doctor for the first time. Literally men queuing up with untreated hernias, or men who needed prosthetics from the war, who didn't have prosthetics but were then queuing to go and see a doctor to get prosthetics or to get spectacles and to get dentures and so on. The shame of need was taken away with the creation of the National Health Service, and it has stood the test of time. And although over the years Tories have tried to attack it, and indeed in the 80s they tried to, especially to undermine its basic structure, the British public has always pushed back against any Tory attempts to undermine that basic system of a universal system, which regardless of your means, you get access to it. It's free at the point of use, and we all pay our taxes to fund it. And yet in the social security system, it's been hacked away, but usually, or always by Tory governments who try to draw these divisions between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. But one of the things that strikes me about the pandemic, to come to your question, Andrew, is that I think those people who, through furlough, who were laid off and who then needed universal credit, I think that so many people were shocked at the inadequacy of the amounts that they were eligible for. And I think it was a moment when people began to think again about this system. I mean, we now have unemployment-related benefits is now, in nominal terms, the lowest it's been for 30 years under the Tories. I do think people have had enough of this. And to come to your point about, yes, I think we have got immediate things we have to fix. The poverty, the deprivation. But we do need to think about fundamentally where we are going. Because actually we've got huge demographic pressures as well. Right? So it's not just what the pandemic has thrown up or brought into sharp focus. It's also the demographic pressures. I mean, you know, we are all, generally speaking, we are living longer than we used to. In fact, there are some academics who argue that a child born today has a 50% chance of living to 100. And not only are we generally living longer, although life expectancy has begun to go backwards in recent times because of austerity, that may pick up again if austerity and cutbacks is ended. Not only are we living longer, we are aging. And we are now at the moment where maybe many of those in the baby boomer generation, and not for me to speculate, but there may be some of that generation in the room tonight. Many of that baby boomer generation have already retired or very close to retirement. So going to be, you know, it's just basic maths. Going to be, you know, drawing pensions and so on. Quite rightly so. I'm not remotely making an argument they shouldn't do that, but there's going to be less working age population. This is a trend which becomes more rapid over the next sort of 10 years or so. So how do we structure a social security system to reflect the fact that we've got these demographic changes? And also the other thing, by the way, in all of this is that those of us who are Generation X, I think that is, and millennials and all these other, or Generation Y, to be frank, we're not really saving enough. We're not saving enough. We're not saving enough in our pension pots. We're not saving enough at all because of the cost of living crisis. It makes it even worse. So you've got all these demographic trends and challenges coming, and you need to design a social security system which reflects that. But it's difficult stuff. And yours very interesting question about the issue of depriving oneself, which obviously has which is a feature of all the faith groups in different ways for all kinds of different theological reasons. But you know, although I have got an A level in religious studies, I dare say you're probably better placed to engage in that question than I am.
It's one of the, I think it's a really important question to be asking, because I think it's crucial to think around the potential for spiritual growth in the context of deprivation in Scripture is only ever thought of. No, there are two things to say. First, that I think there is a difference between a person choosing to live in a way that leads them personally to feel closer to God. There is something that a person can choose on their own spiritual journey. But what we see throughout Scripture is that Jesus was never on the side of structural realities that caused impoverishment, and therefore it is crucial that we advocate not for people's enforced suffering. But I also think there's an interesting point that also, even in the midst of suffering and deprivation, that often, again, with the women that that I know, that I was part of this community in Bethnal Green called The Arch. I was there for the majority of my 20s. A lot of women there would talk about encounters with God or faith in the midst of suffering. And God is not apart from our suffering. He's not apart from us when we are in deprivation, but he never calls us into that place in a way that would cause us harm. But that doesn't mean that we can't have moments of rupture in those spaces of suffering. But I think it's really important never for that to lead to policies. But it does get confused.
Brilliant, fantastic, thank you. Do we have any more questions before we take some online? Yay, one at the back there. Two.
Thank you. I'm Ian Hamlin. Just a very straightforward question, practical question, if I may. I think I could justify theologically, but I won't bother. It seems to me that one of the common cries to change our welfare state in such a way that we can have more faith in it is calls for its simplification. As been someone who's been pastorally involved with people seeking to navigate the welfare system, I've long felt this was a deterrent to effectiveness of it. And I was struck today by the fact that it's also a bolt hole for unscrupulous chancellors to play politics with it by varying different aspects to different taxes and calling it whatever he wants to call it. I wonder whether there's mileage in making more of a campaign of radical simplification that enables easier access and greater transparency.
Martin Jewett from Folkestone in Kent. Florence made the point that the economy needs to be for the people. What do you think about the suggestion that the economy is people? People contributing, people needing things. Jesus, and the economy is people rather than money. Money is probably a useful way of managing the economy. So the economy is really important. And I suppose that means that perhaps there isn't a magic money tree after all. But I just would say that one of the most radical things that Jesus said was that you can't serve God and money.
It's Reverend David Haslam, from Evesham in Worcestershire, former chair of Christian Socialist Movement as it was then. Just a quick comment on food banks first. I chair our local food banks forum in the small town of Evesham, where we've got 4 food banks. And yesterday people were talking about how the demands are rising all the time. And we talked about how that might be dealt with and so on. But at the end I did say, you do realise that last year the 250 richest people in this country, their wealth grew by over £100 billion. There's plenty of money in this country, it's just all being sucked up there. So, but my particular point, or question I wanted to raise was around the NHS, because got 2 good Christian socialist friends who in the last 3 or 4 weeks have both said to me shamefacedly, one with a condition, an eye condition, which could lead quite quickly to blindness, and the other one with a painful hernia, going to the NHS and being told, we can't see this being dealt with for months. So both saying I had to go private. And do we think that actually that is what the Tories are about? That they're so, we still talk about NHS as a jewel in the crown, but I think it's gradually being tarnished. It can't manage what we need. And even the Mail goes on about, you know, you're getting this much more money, what are you going to do for it, that kind of line. So do we think actually that the Tories are about, in the end, dismantling the NHS and you know, turning it at least into a two-tier system where the rich pay and the poor, you know, use the NHS?
Let me just deal with that one, David, directly. So this is something that in my sort of final weeks as the Shadow Health Secretary, I was really getting my teeth into, because waiting lists are now so large and waiting times so long that increasingly numbers of people are, as you say, turning to the private sector for cataract removals, knee replacements, hernias, and so on. And you've got a situation where this is not the wealthy who have got access to private health insurance. This is people taking out loans. There's even examples of people doing sort of online fundraising to get a knee replacement, can you believe? What has increased is the self-pay health market. So that is literally where you turn up and just pay, you know, £12,000 for your hip to be replaced or whatever it is. It's increasingly happening, and because the waits are so intolerable. Now I've lost track of the figures exactly, because understandably I don't pay as much attention to the waiting list figures as I used to do, but we're still talking about hundreds of thousands of people on a waiting list beyond 12 months, some of them waiting beyond 2 years for routine surgery. So people feel that they have no option but to go and pay for an operation in the private sector. This is actually, when sort of Labour campaigners and so on warn about privatisation, this is basically it, because we know from the history of public services that when you have a middle-class flight from a universal public service and you leave that public service to essentially become a public service for the poor, as Richard Titmuss, the great LSE social policy, a very inspirational social policy expert, wrote in the 60s, services for the poor often become poor services. And this is what will undermine a National Health Service if we allow this to happen. It's why it is so serious, and you are right to raise it. And now you are hearing the siren voices from the Tories and the right-wing newspapers talking about giving people tax relief if they take out private insurance schemes. This is what Thatcher and Nigel Lawson tried to do in the 80s. Eventually, it didn't work, and it got closed down. But this was Thatcher's attempt in the 80s to undermine the Universal National Health Service, and this is how it's done. It's not quite when. It's not like the NHS gets sold off. It doesn't work like that. Although, you know, it's probably, you know, it's a sort of campaign phrase. It's when people move into the private sector and they get tax relief for it. I think that's where some of the right-wing Tory MPs are pushing them. On this simplification point, you're absolutely right, because the social security system has obviously been built up over many years, and it's a bit like sort of sediment, sort of building up. You know, every sort of tweak and change leaves behind a sort of set of complexities, and it becomes a completely entangled web, which is bewildering for the citizen, is often bewildering for those who have got trained in benefits advice as well. And as you say, it can end up with the consequence of people not claiming their full entitlement to benefits. The problem is, and this is a genuine philosophical issue for those of us who are, you know, on the left. I mean, there was traditionally a big campaign against means-tested benefits on the left, because people remember the indignity of how the poor laws used to operate, where people had to sort of prove that they were impoverished enough to get a charity handout in the old system. And which was why there was always a strong argument for good universal benefits. But when you know you have got people's circumstances who are, through no fault of their own, can be complex, sometimes chaotic, they may have particular extra needs, then you need to have, yes, some universality in the system, but you also need to make sure that those who need it get the extra support. Right? So it's, when we were in government, we used to call it progressive universalism. Or did we call it universal progressive? Anyway, we called it something... progressive universalism. Johnny corrects. I told you I'd need Johnny to correct me at some point. So it's always that debate. I mean, if you want to target more particular help for those who need it, inevitably you're going to have some complexity in the system. But what drives me mad on this, by the way, they spent millions creating this whole new fancy universal credit computer system in order to be able to have a smoother system. And it's all supposed to be very agile, and they're supposed to be able to deal with all this now. And yet they're still refusing to give people adequate means. And they claim, people have got to wait 5 weeks because, we can't do it. It's nonsense, of course, they can do it. If I can order shopping on my phone now and it can turn up on my doorstep, probably even later tonight or first thing in the morning, I'm pretty sure the government can sort out its computer system to pay people universal credit and don't force people to wait in poverty for 5 weeks. Do you want to deal with the other one?
Yeah, thank you. I think for me, these questions are kind of all quite connected and come back to the political imagination that's underlying the structures that want to atomize us to such an extent that we feel as if that and put the responsibility on us to such an extent that we actually practically have to pay for our own knee replacements and those sorts of things, that refuses to see that we are all connected. And it's why, the economy is made up of people, and we need to recover the power that is in that, right? That we are, that the economy is not simply made of money, but it's made of people, and that therefore it needs to serve people. Like, it reminds me of the Sabbath was not created, man was not created for the Sabbath was created for the man. The economy should serve people rather than us serve money. And so what does it look like to create an economic system, a welfare system, an NHS that returns the centrality of human flourishing? And in terms of simplicity, at the Arch, I was a support worker. So again, trained to help people navigate through these systems. And it was impossible. And that's with training. It's so complicated. And there is no silver bullet to make things simple, but we need to start by recognizing that it is intentionally complicated, and that actually we need to restore a principle of simplicity, or at least a principle of accessibility, because actually it's quite simple for me to get the help that I need, because it was designed with me in mind. And if I was male, it would be simpler, right? There are particular images of people who. Well, there are particular people who design these systems, and those people tend to be of a particular positionality in society. And I think fundamental to putting people back at the center of resisting this, the individuation of people, and also of creating simpler services, is to increase the number of people who actually have the needs that we're talking about, to be increasing the representation of those people in the rooms in which policy decisions get made, and recognize, reclaiming our power when ordinary people get to be put into positions in which real decisions get to be made.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Lou, should we see if we've got any questions online?
Have we got any online?
Great.
Well, I'm going to go to this person here, and then I'm going to Hannah. We've got enough for just 3 questions.
Yeah.
Marsha, is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Hi, Katrina from Vauxhall. John, I really related to your comment about reading the scriptures and just coming away with a renewed kind of oomph in socialist leaning. And I just wondered if you had any words of wisdom on how to engage our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ who read the same scriptures and come away with a very different political view.
Great question. That's a good one.
I'm Hannah Rich, I'm the Vice Chair of Christians on the Left, and I was monitoring the Twitter for questions, but in the absence of any, I will take the liberty of having one myself. Just briefly, what do you think of the idea of a wealth tax? And in the absence of, or short of waiting for the next Labour government, which I hope will not be very long away, is there an argument you think might work to get that to come about sooner, or is there anything we can do to get that to come about sooner than waiting for the next election?
Great. Was there one more? Or? No, that's fine.
The back of the room.
Get your steps in, Lou.
Hi, I'm Charlie Wiseman from Battersea. I was saying to Marsha earlier, it's setting up a memorial garden for key workers. It already exists, the memorial garden at the bottom of Falcon Road and Hoxton's. And I just wonder how much welfare is connected to connecting to nature as well, and how much trouble I've had just trying to get permission from the now commercial running of these parks and what everyone thinks.
Okay. How do you convince somebody who draws a different interpretation for script? Well, I don't know, really. Look, people will think about things and reflect on things and will come to their own views in life. I obviously fundamentally disagree with those who have a different view of the world, but equally I perfectly respect their rights to have that different view. I've never been a politician who, even where I disagree with people, sort of wants to sort of traduce their beliefs or question their values. So I try to treat political opponents with respect. I mean, hopefully, people do reflect. People do change their minds. I mean, and we need people to change their minds because we need people to do what, in more places, do what Marsha did, which is win constituencies off Conservatives. So maybe Marsha is better placed to answer that one. She's obviously more persuasive than I am on these some of these things. On things like, we need tax justice. Our tax system isn't fair, and that's why one of the things that Rachel Reeves has been quite rightly calling for is a windfall tax and these extraordinary profits these gas and oil producers have been making, and redistributing the proceeds of that into helping some of the poorest people in society. But we clearly need tax justice, and we've just got to make the arguments and campaign and march and lobby. And I'll make a final point on this green point, which I'm actually really pleased that someone's mentioned this, because it allows me to just bore on for a minute or two about one of my sort of obsessions, which is so you've all got an hour, yeah? So which is, and I think it's topical because it is the 2-year anniversary of the lockdown. By the way, I'll just tell you this: I went 2 years ago, before the lockdown. I actually went into Downing Street to see Boris Johnson because he was trying to get our support for lockdowns. And I'll be absolutely honest with you, I've never had anything to do with Boris Johnson. It's a weird place, the House of Commons. You wander around, you walk past politicians, some of them are friendly, and you do get to know some politicians on the other side because they say hello. Others, they just walk past you. That's fair enough. It's, I don't expect everyone to be best friends with everyone, but I've never had anything to do with Boris Johnson, really. And I always kind of assumed all that kind of blah, 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 it was a sort of act. And he was utterly like that in a private meeting in Downing Street. And I was sat there looking at him, and there was Chris Whitty was there, Dominic Cummings was there at the time, and I was looking at him thinking, is this for real? And he's doing all this, blah, blah, well, blah, blah, and that sort of stuff. And at the point I said, look, we are prepared as a Labour opposition to support. We didn't realise it was going to be a lockdown as severe as what came in. At that point, we thought there were going to be other restrictions. It was only when we got deeper into it that we realised there'd have to be a lockdown, and I actually called for lockdown before we went into one. And I said, look, we're prepared to support some of this, but you've got to do something for workers, and you've got to do something on statutory sick pay. So actually it was through that we got a deal with them to pay statutory sick pay on day one. Now, of course, they're getting rid of statutory sick pay from day one as a result of the COVID Act. But anyway, the point what I'm making is that this pandemic has come about because a virus vaulted from an animal and came to humans. Now, there's lots of debates and discussions about whether that happened in a market or whether there's something funny went on in a lab. It doesn't matter. Whichever one it is, the reality is the virus jumped from animals to humans. And the point is this: there is no healthy future without a green future, because the more that we destroy biodiversity across the world, and the more that we allow the globe to heat up, the more that we are going to bring ourselves into the exposure of new viruses jumping from animal to human. The more the globe heats up, the more the further mosquitoes will fly, carrying malaria. The more that we destroy biodiversity in parts of the world, the more that viruses, which have literally been in mammals in caves who have been undisturbed for generations, the more that that we will be exposed to some of these very dangerous. I'm not saying there'll be pandemics of the scale that we are still actually in. It may well be local epidemics, but there'll be more infectious disease taking off. So you're absolutely right. We should take nature and the environment, biodiversity, we should take protecting it more seriously, because it is a good thing in itself. But actually, if we don't, we are putting ourselves at risk of future pandemics as well. So I'm sorry to finish on that rather depressing note, actually, but to just say thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to do a meeting in person after these last 2 years. It's been a pleasure to be here, and I'm absolutely convinced that with brilliant people like you supporting us and campaigning for us on the streets and in your communities, that we will get a Labour government at the next general election. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, John. And I just want to say on that note, as we do draw to a close, I want to show my appreciation for both of you, Flo and John, just for giving us such greater insights, but for everybody here that also made contributions, because I think we all know the welfare state, there is so much to it, there are many facets to it, but we know that if it's rooted in our values, then we certainly can give the people of the country the hope that we also need and deserve. On that note, can I invite Lou up, who wants to really close out today. For those who don't know, she is a director of Christians on the Left, but we all know Lou, don't we?
Thank you. Well, what a fabulous night it's been. Yeah. Thank you to Marsha for chairing the dialogue so well, and thank you to Flo, a brand new friend to Christians on the Left, but I'm sure we're all like writing down, yes, we need Flo back. Yeah. and to John, John and I devised this event in a curry house in Sheffield 3 years ago, where he said, we need to do an event together. So this is all for John's benefit. So thank you, John. Thank you. For those who are not involved in Christians on the Left, we seek to gather, inspire, equip and resource Christians on the left of British politics. We're also an affiliate of the Labour Party, which you might have guessed already. So we act as that bridge between the UK Church and the party. If you're interested in joining us, there's lots of information on our website. So please do join us, because we have monthly prayer meetings, Zooms, campaigns. We'll be at the Labour Party conference later this year, and the Archbishop of York will be preaching at the church service at Labour Party conference this year. So we're very excited about that. So thank you for joining us. Safe travels. If you are still around, we'll be going directly next door to the Westminster Arms. So feel free to join us for a drink and for chat. But please put your hands together for our brilliant Marsha, Flo and John. Thank you.